Well, happy June the 1st to you. I bet you didn't believe that May was already gone. We're supposed to be in the summer, and right now it's about 63, 64 degrees where I am, so summer has not arrived here yet. But that's okay with me because I like the cool weather. In any case, in 1 Samuel, we've been looking at chapter 27 and 28, and we've seen the cat and mouse racing around that has been done between Saul and David. And last time we looked, we saw that Saul was asking for a diviner to call up Samuel from the dead and to give him some advice, and Saul didn't like the advice very much. He said, David's going to be the king, and yes, the Spirit of God has left you, so tough stuff. In any case, in chapter 29, we kind of have a transition to taking a look at what David's doing, and David, of course, has joined the enemy, the Philistines, and he is going to go to battle with them, with Achish, who is the son of a Philistine king. And when they arrive with the rest of the troops of the Philistines, the rest of the troops don't like the idea that David's along. As a matter of fact, they bring up something to Achish that maybe they wanted to forget, but it says, do you remember the song that he used to sing in Israel? Saul has killed his thousands while David has killed his tens of thousands, talking about killing Philistines. They weren't too anxious to have David join them, in spite of Achish's testimony about David's faithfulness to him. They say they just don't believe that he's on the up and up, and they want him to go back. And they certainly bring up the song to Achish, and they say that he's really just tagging along, so he's going to turn on them and try to win back the favoritism to Saul. In any case, after so much debate, we find that David agrees to go back, and the Philistines continue on towards battle. But 3 days later, when David arrives back at Ziklag, the Amorites have come in and raided the area where his family and all of his 600 men's families and children were, and the city has been burned to the ground, and the families have been taken. And David is beside himself, but his troops are even more beside themselves because they kind of blame David for having dragged them, first of all, into the Philistine area, but then the fact that their families were taken, and they would really like to just go ahead and kill David. Nevertheless, David took strength from the Lord. Let me say that again for you. In chapter 30, verses 1 through 6, we see this terrible situation, the devastation of a city, the taking of families, David's own men turning on him and wanting to kill him. And it says, David took strength from the Lord. What an incredible testimony. In any case, David sends to Abiathar, who is one of the ones that escaped slaughter of the priests, and he's asking him to bring the ephod. And when he has the ephod, he asked God, he said, should we chase after the Amalekites and try to take back our families? And God says, yes, you will win, you will prevail, go ahead and do that. David takes his 600 troops and starts chasing after the Amalekites. By the time they reach a brook, there's 200 of his men that are very tired and can't go on any further. They stay back. The other 400 continue. They find an Egyptian boy who was a servant to the Amalekites, but had been deserted by them because he was sick, and he wants to get away from the Amalekites as well as away from the enemies that he has. So he leads David and his men to the place where the Amalekites have been camping, and they're having a party, and they're under the influence of alcohol and dancing and carrying on, and David and his troops sweep in. They defeat them, and only 400 of the Amalekites escape on camels, and David and his men get all of the flocks and all of the herds that the Amalekites have been taking in all of their battles and victories. And they start back with their families, David and his two wives who have been retaken by David, and they're all headed back to their own area. And when they get back to the same brook where the 200 men dropped off, his 400 don't want to share the flocks and the herds with the 200 that have been left behind. But David said it's right to share. And he makes a law that says that those that guard the home grounds share alike just with those that go to battle. And not only that, but when David gets back, he decides to share some of the herds and flocks with those who have been taken advantage of by the Amalekites, and he shows his generosity, his compassion, by sharing that which has been taken. Interesting, a lot of good principles here, and I think it's worth applying it to our lives today. Remember, your past will always be remembered. David's past of those singing, David has killed his 10,000s, came back to roost. But your past, whether it's good or whether it's bad, will always show back up again. And so it's important for us to live each day in a way that we would be proud when our past is brought up. Secondly, we find that the bitterness and the anguish and the grief that is often felt in the loss, as his 600 men felt when they came back and found their town burned, their children and their wives gone, and all of their possessions, that anger and that grief was turned against David, not for any good reason. And I think we need to remember that. Sometimes when people are in grief and anger, they wind up misdirecting that anger and grief, and instead of directing it to the Amalekites, they directed it to David. And so we need to remember, and we need to be patient with those that perhaps turn on us in their anger and grief and say things that they don't really mean, but they're just expressing outwardly the inward grief and anger that they have. We also need to learn the principle of sharing in our prosperity. We see that with David, making sure that the 200 that were just exhausted, but who were willing to go and were willing to be faithful to David, that he shared with them, as well as those others that had suffered loss in his prosperity. David was willing to share in his prosperity, and I think all of us need to remember that. We need to share in our prosperity, and when we can help others, when we've come into good fortune and prosperity, we should be sure to do what we can to share with others. A lot of good lessons in this particular chapter. It's the last chapter before we close out 1 Samuel. Hope that you'll apply them to your lives. God bless you and have a great day.
We live in a broken world, surrounded by broken lives, broken relationships, and broken systems. This brokenness is seen in suffering, violence, poverty, pain, and death around us. Brokenness leads us to search for a way to make life work. In contrast to this brokenness, we also see beauty, purpose, and evidence of design around us. The Bible tells us that God originally planned a world that worked perfectly, where everything and everyone fit together in harmony. God made each of us with a purpose, to worship Him and walk with Him. Life doesn't work when we ignore God and His original design for our lives. We selfishly insist on doing things our own way. The Bible calls this sin. We all sin and distort the original design. The consequence of our sin is separation from God, in this life and for all of eternity. Sin leads to a place of brokenness. We see this all around us and in our own lives as well. When we realize life is not working, we begin to look for a way out. We tend to go in many directions, trying different things to figure it out on our own. Brokenness leads to a place of realizing a need for something greater. At this point, we need a remedy, some good news. Because of His love, God did not leave us in our brokenness. Jesus, God in human flesh, came to us and lived perfectly according to God's design. Jesus came to rescue us, to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. He took our sin and shame to the cross, paying the penalty of our sin by His death. Jesus was then raised from the dead to provide the only way for us to be rescued and restored to a relationship with God. This is the good news. This is the gospel. Simply hearing this good news is not enough. We must admit our sinful brokenness and stop trusting in ourselves. We don't have the power to escape this brokenness on our own. We need to be rescued. We must ask God to forgive us, turning from sin to trust only in Jesus. This is what it means to repent and believe. Believing, we receive new life through Jesus, and God turns our lives in a new direction. When God restores our relationship to Him, we begin to discover meaning and purpose in a broken world. Now we can pursue God's design in all areas of our lives. Even when we fail, we understand God's pathway to be restored, this same good news of Jesus. God's Spirit empowers us to recover His design and assures us of His presence in this life and for all of eternity.